Hello, everybody. So this is the presentation on music history of the late 1800s. I have also titled this Bridging the Divide. This is kind of talking about the division between the US before and after the Civil War, and also the divide that exists amongst the people and the music styles of the era. So we're gonna get started. So just to review, we talked a lot about the Civil War, so now we're moving into after the Civil War. Um, the big thing with the Civil War was the difference between military marches and African American slave spirituals. That we spent a lot of time covering and kind of the fundamental differences structurally of those, and also the differences in theme. And we spent a ton of time in class on that, so I'm not going to go any further to that. So then we get into after the Civil War and kind of what this means for music. Um, Music evolves, which is one of the beautiful parts about music. It is affected by everything around it. It's affected by history and math and science, and that's why we learn about music. We get in touch with what was going on in history. And we also get to know a little bit about what it is to be human. And these are really important things, which is, the primary reason we study music. Um, so as music moved on, the style grew, and they mixed and they made up a lot of what music is today. In this presentation, we're going to talk a lot about ragtime music, jazz, blues, community bands, which is kind of where the military marches moved to, as well as romanticism and that kind of era and what happened in history after the Civil War, up until the very, very early 1900s. So the first thing is the birth of ragtime. Ragtime was identified by the heavy use of piano, and syncopation, which we will talk about a lot, specifically for jazz. And syncopation is kind of the uh, sorry, um, is the use of the offbeat. One of the A lot of music follows the patterns where the influences are on one and three. Ragtime was a lot more focused on two and four. It also used a lot of eighth notes, so we get a lot of those off beats, and those were kind of very symptomatic of ragtime. This was an almost perfect blending of military marches and African musical traditions. So it is definitely one of the big things to come out of the Civil War. It did eventually lead to swing music. Famous composers for ragtime include Scott Joplin, who is the photo right down there in the corner, um, Antonin Dvorak, Claude Debussy, Irving Berlin, and Igor Stravinsky. Um, Dvorak, Debussy, and Stravinsky are also Romanticism composers, but they did dabble in ragtime, which is why I included them in this portion. Um, At the bottom of this is a link to the Maple Leaf Rag, which is one of the most famous ragtimes of all time. And that was written by Scott Joplin. The only one that may be a little more famous is also Scott Joplin. It's called The Entertainer. If you've ever heard the stereotypical like ice cream truck, the Entertainer is that. So you may hear ragtime um, more often than you think. I don't know if ice cream trucks are a thing in Houston. They were in my hometown, and so I heard the Entertainer a lot growing up. Um, Now we are going to blues. So blues grew from work songs and field hollers, from when they were working in plantations. Um, it created a lot of this call and response idea. That's what motif means. Motif means idea. So it was a lot of repetition. One of the big things about the blues is one of the primary structures was one line that was repeated and varied multiple times in a row. Sorry. The songs in the blues were sad and expressive, and that's kind of where the term came from. Um, they were they made you feel a lot of feelings, specifically feelings that were sad, and therefore blues became an appropriate title for it. Um, Charlotte Fortin, who was a blues singer, once said, "Blues can't be sung without a full heart and a troubled spirit." So the big emphasis there is the troubled spirit. Um, so it was a lot of kind of the human connection of music. We do still see blues today. It grew into, I mean, we still have regular blues, but it grew into country, R&B, which was the eventual birth of hip hop. R&B actually means rhythm and blues. And it led to rock and roll. So big names like the Beatles and Tracy Chapman are big blues artists that kind of grew out of this. Famous artists of this era include Jelly Roll Morton, who is up in that corner, um, Ma Rainey, who was a big blues singer, and W.C. Handy, who was a blues composer. There is another link down there for you to listen to. It's called Jealous Heart Blues, and it is sung by Ma Rainey. It's a really good song. Definitely listen to it. Um, which all of this led to jazz. We are going to spend a lot of time talking about jazz later in the semester. We're going to do an entire like unit on jazz. So we're not going to get too deep into that for this moment. Um, it grew in popularity in the late 1800s. Jazz kind of always existed as long as African Americans have been in America. Jazz has existed. But it really wasn't discovered until the late 1800s, and then it became the height of music by the 1920s. And that is called the Jazz Age, and we will get into that a lot more later um, on the Jazz Age. Jazz really started up in New Orleans, which is, just a hop, skip, and a jump from here. It was a mixture of ragtime and blues, but it was really focused on improvisation. And so there's not a lot of surviving jazz pieces because, oh, sorry, my other cat now felt the need to come say hi.